course, anytime we're talking about regulation, and most people in the country really don't get this, but what we're talking about with regulation is we're talking about legislation. We just happen to be talking about legislation that's happening through delegations from Congress, where the authority to legislate resides under the Constitution, to agencies, where the authority to legislate resides under Supreme Court precedent, under the delegation doctrine. Legislation, of course, is Article 1 of the Constitution for a reason. The Revolution was fought and the Constitution was written to respond definitively, perhaps more than anything, to abuses of legislative power committed by the English Crown and Parliament in the run-up to the Revolution. As I think Matt referred to, the Federalist Papers outline some of the strengths for the constitutional model of legislating and some of the evils and some of the mischief that arise when one starts to legislate off of that model. And I think if you look around how things have played out since legislative authority was allowed to be delegated to the agencies many decades ago, what you can observe is a growing creep in the volume and depth of the mischief that arises, because essentially what we're talking about with the current regulatory structure is we're talking about a model for legislation that, for lack of a better kind of rough way to put it, has more or less gone off the constitutional model. And it happens now under the Administrative Procedure Act, under various ancillary statutes to that act that have been passed over the years, the Congressional Review Act, the Paperwork Reduction Act, the Regulatory Flexibility Act, the list goes on. The APA itself is relatively sketchy and weak. The ancillary statutes are likewise relatively sketchy and much weaker, and in many cases not even judicially reviewable, unlike the APA, as Boyd and Gray pointed out to you. To give you a rough kind of estimation of what the current statutory structure is about, we'll feed into some of the talk about current proposals to reform that structure. Congress, when delegation of legislation began to happen full throttle, it instituted the Administrative Procedure Act. This was in 1946. And not surprisingly, it instituted a roughly light-handed model for governing it that is the kind of model the Constitution sets out for the Congress, quite frankly. And it, in many ways, instituted a structure that tried to mirror the way that Congress went about legislating. So we have a number of procedures that are intended to help an agency identify a problem, much as Congress would, whether formally or informally, through its own investigations or outreach to the agency to identify a problem, procedures to then hold hearings or otherwise review input. So we had formal rulemaking, which is what the framers of the APA thought would be the primary mode of regulatory activity. And then we have non-hearing based informal procedures that are based on notice and comment that tend to substitute a more formally gathered record standing in the shoes of a hearing record that an agency then responds to. And then we have the final provisions for how an agency puts out its final decision, the legislative product, the regulation, much as Congress puts out a statute. And in the end, too, authority for judicial review, so that the courts have the role of saying what the law actually means, be it in the case of a statute, interpretation of a statute that Congress has passed, irrespective of what an agency says, be it a regulation or a statute the agency has interpreted, what that actually finally means in terms of the words of the legislative product. I want to get at one of the key problems with that conception that works its way into the problem that we've seen now from the regulatory state overreaching, going off the rails, causing too many problems of its own, and some of the thinking behind some of the legislative remedies to that are currently in play in the House and the Senate. And first and foremost to my mind is the issue of accountability. The model of legislating that the Congress sets forth that the Constitution sets forth for the Congress rests very heavily on the notion that ultimately the legislators in our bodies are accountable to the public via the ballot box. And the public can very readily work its will in response to misguided, overreaching, unsound, ill-considered, or otherwise bad actions, at least bad as perceived by the public. Agencies don't have that kind of accountability. And if that kind of real accountability to the public is the fulcrum, so to speak, of how the legislative process works in a productive way, once that's missing, all kinds of problems can arise. And the reason that's missing from the regulatory structure is, of course, that regulation happens in the executive branch. The only accountable official in the executive branch is the president, accountable at the ballot box. Presidential appointees, who are relatively few compared to the size of the civil service, are indirectly accountable to the people through the confirmation process one time when their nominations come before the Senate, and can then be held accountable by members of Congress through the appropriations process and oversight, but ultimately they're not accountable to the people for anything. So there start to be problems, and those problems become worse the more delegations happen to agencies and the more actions agencies take to implement those delegations, simply because the volume of actions and the magnitude of individual actions that feed into the overall weight of product coming out of the executive branch via delegation is something that a body like Congress with 435 members has an extraordinarily hard time rendering accountable. You all know, for example, we just had presidential veto of the Congressional Review Act resolution overturning the recent NLRB action. Congress was able to pass a resolution on one very important, very high-profile issue. The president was able to veto that. Of the 3,000 to 4,000 actions that come out of the agencies every year, how many of them even get a chance to get a sniff at a Congressional Review Act resolution or any other kinds of effective check from Congress? And then we turn to the issues that were talked about at the panel that Ambassador Gray and his colleagues were on of accountability to the courts. Well, if we have a situation in which many actions are shielded from judicial review by the kinds of tactics that Ambassador Gray talked about, where we have a situation in which agency legislative product, when it arrives in the courts, is heavily, the action is heavily predisposed to favor the agency because of things like the Chevron deference doctrine for statutory interpretation, the Auer doctrine for regulatory interpretation, something called the Baltimore Gas and Electric doctrine. It gives the highest level of deference to agencies when courts review the scientific and technical findings of agencies. It's a pretty highly stacked deck, and it's very, very hard for the judiciary to effectively hold the executive branch legislative entities into account. And then you have the White House. The White House is dealing with the same problem of the flood and the flow of actions by the agencies subordinate to it. The White House is subject to the same phenomena as members here are, in that they're constantly being tasked to respond to emerging crises and other emerging big issues that occupy time. And so the ability for the White House itself to hold the executive agencies who are exercising delegations accountable is limited. What does all that say? In the end, it says, I think that Congress needs to seriously reconsider a lot of the statutory structure that governs how the agencies carry out delegations. And ultimately, I would hope the Supreme Court would reconsider things like the delegation doctrine and the Chevron doctrine and the other deference doctrines to try and finally bring things more to heel. That being said, with those kind of framing remarks, let me turn it over to the other presenters so they can present their material to you, and we'll look forward to your questions.
So that was a wonderful framing, sort of a big picture view of all the problems associated with the regulatory process that we have today. And I want to similarly take a big picture view and highlight some principles that solutions to the problem of what I call regulatory accumulation, which I think is at the heart of all of this. So let me take over. I'll just switch over to here. So regulatory accumulation can be easily seen with pictures, which I like. So this is a picture of the total number of pages published in the Code of Federal Regulations each year from 1975 through 2012. And you can see that we started at about 70,000 pages back in the mid-70s, and we're at over 175,000 pages of regulations that are in effect published in 2012. What the takeaway here is a consistent growth. You can almost draw a straight line and have a slope there that just goes up over time. There's some peaks and there's some valleys here and there, but we have a process that always leads to more regulation. Seldom does it lead to going back and getting rid of old regulations, maybe obsolete regulations or those regulations that did not work. And you're aware that that has its problems, but let's go back and examine why that comes about in the first place. This is sort of a very simplified summary of what Daniel was kind of running through earlier. Ultimately, regulations do come from Congress. Congress takes actions, passes an act, and then that turns into statutes, and then, as you know, that will then be acted upon by agencies, and then agencies ultimately spit out the regulations that you see in the Code of Federal Regulations on the previous picture. But it's a very linear process. There's not much room for feedback going back from the regulations and the regulations' effects to Congress, so then maybe Congress could revisit what it's done with its original statutes. Why is that a problem? Well, you talked some earlier about the economic effects of regulations, but here's a few more that I want to highlight quickly. For one, regulations, as you may know, have a regressive effect. A regressive effect is one that disproportionately harms low-income households relative to middle or high-income households. And so let me illustrate that with a concrete example here. In 2006, the FDA banned the use of chlorofluorocarbons in medical inhalers, like the inhalers that people use to treat asthma. Subsequently, the price of medical inhalers tripled. That price effect, is just one example of how regulations can make things more expensive in thousands and thousands of products that people use every day. So if you imagine all of the regulatory price effects for all the things that a person or a household consumes over a year. We don't know what the number is, what that dollar figure is, but there's some dollar figure. There's some regulatory price effect. That's how much more expensive things are because of regulations. For an illustrative example, let's say it's about $1,250. This shows you the differential effects of $1,250 on a low-income household compared to a high-income household. On the left there is a low-income household making about $28,000. That's where the poverty line is. And to them, a $1,250 regulatory price effect is 4.4% of annual income. In the other column, you have a high-income household making about $275,000 a year. To that high-income household, it's only about 0.4% of their annual income. That is a regressive effect. That disproportionately harms the low-income household compared to the high-income household because all prices of goods and services across the board are increased because of regulatory accumulation. Second, regulation can block innovation. Richard mentioned that one of the projects that I work on is a project called Reg Data. With Reg Data, we go through the Code of Federal Regulations. One thing we do is we look at words like shall or must or may not. They create a specific prohibition or a requirement to take an action or not take an action. So you can think of that conceptually. If there's a shall that says you shall not do something, well, if that something was an innovative business opportunity, you can't do it anymore. That's how it can block innovation. Let me give a specific example again. This is a picture of what headlights could be. Headlights have been addressed by regulation in several ways, but many decades ago, the Department of Transportation addressed headlight manufacture and sale by saying that headlights have to have high beams and low beams and nothing in between. And so the reason for that, it makes some sense. You don't want cars to blind oncoming traffic when they're driving the opposite direction. So you want cars to be able to switch to low beams in those occasions. But that regulation was not smartly designed. What that regulation could have said, rather than you must have high beams and low beams and nothing in between, is you must have headlight systems that are capable of not blinding oncoming traffic. But that wasn't how it was done. And so as a result, we have high beams and low beams and nothing in between. On the other hand, in Asia, in Europe, there are what's called adaptive headlight systems that, if you can see here, there's an area where the oncoming car is that's a little bit darker. That's where the low beams are shining. And then everywhere else, the high beams are shining. So it's mixing high beams and low beams. The result is no one's blinded by high beams, but people on the sides of the roads, pedestrians and wildlife, can be more easily seen. It's a safer system. We didn't invent that in America. We don't sell that in America. We don't have that on cars in America because of the intransigence of the regulatory system. So that's innovation, specific example that we only know about because it was invented elsewhere and not here. Who knows what else we've missed out on? And third, regulation can hinder entrepreneurship. One way is by blocking innovation, just like I explained. But another way that regulation can hinder entrepreneurship is a sort of death by a thousand cuts effect. If you imagine you're a small business owner, or even a city or a state who's thinking about taking on some sort of project, the more regulations you have to deal with, you have to comply with, even if it's just paperwork, make that project more expensive. At some point, the cost of all the regulation may make you make the decision to not engage in that project rather than to do it. May make you not be entrepreneurial rather than be entrepreneurial. So here's a specific example. Logan City, Utah, a few years back, had to do some repair work on a pipeline. So this is not actually Logan, Utah, but it's similar. There's a river and there's mountains and there is a pipeline that's there that they use for their culinary water supply. And they had to do some repair work, and they decided while they're doing that repair work, let's install a micro hydropower system. That's basically a water wheel. You put a water wheel and have the river run through that water, or the pipeline will bring water through the wheel, and it spins, and you generate electricity, green power, very clean. So that was their idea. They could do that for about $1.5 million, and it'd take about 1 year to construct it. Then they found out that they were going to have to deal with a nexus of paperwork. The list of paperwork is too long for me to memorize, so I had to write it down. They ended up having to deal with regulations that all stem from various acts of Congress, including the Energy Policy Act of 2005, the Federal Deepwater Port Act of 1974, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Coastal Zone Management Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act, the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, the National Historic Preservation Act, the Rivers and Harbors Act, and the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. Easy for me to say. And that's just the acts of Congress, which of course created many more regulations from various agencies. And you probably noticed a theme for most of those. Most of those had an environmental theme. But here's an environmentally entrepreneurial project that's being held back by a lot of red tape from environmental acts of Congress. Now, whether or not they have an effect, I don't know. But the point here is, with all these things piling up, the decision to make this clean, green power system may have been altered had they known about it. In fact, they didn't know about it, ended up paying about $3 million to build it and taking 4 years instead of 1 year to build it. But then that lesson may have been learned by other cities, right? Other cities observed what Logan did, and maybe other cities then made the decision not to go into this entrepreneurial endeavor. So, transparency has been emphasized here today. This is one of the problems with what we have, and let me while thinking about solutions to it, you may be thrown sort of a red herring that there is transparency with regulations today because we have regulatory impact analyses. We have effectively agencies doing benefit cost analyses of their rules. Well, unfortunately, the picture is not so nice. This is a graph showing you the rules that had regulatory impact analyses, these benefit cost analyses that were reviewed by OIRA, which is an office in OMB, for quality. About 34,000 rules were created in the decade from 2004 to 2013. Of those, only about 3,000 were reviewed by OIRA. So that's a pretty small percentage, but it's even worse. Only 116 of those reviewed by OIRA had cost estimates and benefits estimates. That's about 0.4%. So that's not transparency. In fact, that's probably flying in the dark, not knowing what the costs and benefits of regulations are going to be before you create them. Second, there's a lack of accountability, and this has also been emphasized. In the case of regulatory accumulation, one form of accountability is having agencies be accountable for whether their rules actually worked, having some way to go back and seeing if they were effective, or seeing if, even if they were effective, if the costs were justified by the benefits that you saw. Well, it's been mentioned that every president since Jimmy Carter has worried about this problem, this issue of regulatory accumulation, and unfortunately, they've never been able to solve it, largely because there's not been accountability. When presidents tell agencies to go back and look at their own rules, tell me whether your rules are good or not, well, that's sort of like, well, I teach a class over at George Mason University. I think actually it would be pretty wonderful if I could just tell my students right after I give them the final exam and they write pages and pages for their final exam, I just turn around and have them grade their final exam. That would save me a lot of work. But I don't think that would be a very fair assessment of how much they learned in my class. I don't think the dean would be happy with that. In the same way, the president shouldn't expect agencies to review their own rules and be very honest about it. Agencies have incentive to show that their rules were the greatest thing since sliced bread. As proof, I take you back to another version of that very first picture I showed you. This is showing the number of pages added to or subtracted from the CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations, in each year for the past 37 years. And only 7 of those years, 2 of them under Reagan, did we see a decrease in regulation from year to year. So this shows the lack of effectiveness of executive orders telling agencies to look back. Finally, on top of that, we have a lack of useful analysis. This goes back to that first point, regulatory impact analyses, and well, at least they're done sometimes, and they're done for major rules. Well, it's even worse than that. Even when they are done, sometimes they're not done all that well. In fact, at Mercatus, we have a project called the Regulatory Report Card, where we have looked at over 100 of these major rules and the accompanying regulatory impact assessment. Again, the benefit cost analysis that goes along with these things. And you know the process here. You want to think about some basic things. Number one, in this analysis, you want to show that there's actually a problem that needs to be solved. Number two, you want to look at various alternatives, different ways to solve that problem. And then once you've done that, you want to look at the costs and benefits of those alternatives. Fairly basic recipe for doing an analysis. Unfortunately, that recipe on average is not followed very well. We scored all these, and on a scale from 0 to 5, where 5 is the best and 0 is the worst, the average score is about 3 out of 5. If you were one of my students, you would be getting a failing grade. So how do we solve it? A few principles to keep in mind. First, think back to that regulatory accumulation graph. Part of the problem is that we keep on adding more rules on there. That's part of the accumulation process. What we want to avoid is rules that don't do their job, or that do their job at such an expense that it doesn't justify the benefits. These are what we call non-functional rules. And I'm going to run through just a simplified example of how you could test a regulation prior to making it for whether it's functional. So in your regulatory analysis, prior to making a rule, you ask a simple question: is there a significant risk? Now, risk is important here. It's a concept that you should really apply to regulation in general. Regulations can be thought of as always dealing with some sort of risk. It could be risk of human health hazard from environmental pollution. It could be risk of some sort of financial collapse or calamity. It could be risk of workplace safety hazards. These are all sorts of risks that regulations do try to deal with. Well, so the first question, given that you're dealing with risk, is there a significant risk that only regulation can solve? If the answer is no, then maybe you should stop with the rulemaking there. Secondly, I have current risk. Maybe the way of thinking about it is it an outdated risk? The market moves quickly. Regulatory agencies don't. By the time a rule can get out the door, it's possible the market has moved along and the problem is no longer there. So is the risk outdated? That's another reason you might want to stop the rule. There's others, of course, but this is a simplified example of how you can test whether a rule is functional prior to making the rule. So you want to have some sort of, in your mind, in your principles for solving the problem, you want to think, how can I make sure we get better regulatory analysis out of the procedure that we have? Second, again, thinking back to that graph of regulatory accumulation, how can we get rid of some of the old rules that are there if they're outdated or if they're ineffective, or if they're duplicative? This can be done with a good retrospective analysis. I say a good retrospective analysis because not all retrospective analyses are created equal. So some principles on how to do a good one. How do you get it right for retrospective analysis? First and foremost, you need to have independence. I can't emphasize that enough. You cannot put the agencies in charge of reviewing their own rules. So whether it's an independent commission or an independent agency or some sort of independent body, that's the way to have honest assessment, honest analysis of whether rules are non-functional or functional. And second, once you've got that, the process is fairly similar to what you would do for prospective analysis, for analysis of a rule that's being considered. You want to look at risk and you want to look at outcomes. We already talked about looking at risk. Again, you go through this sort of simplified decision tree. Is there a significant risk? Is there a current risk? And then secondly, you want to look at, since we're talking about retrospective analysis, did the regulation achieve what it was supposed to achieve? Did it achieve the outcomes that were desired? If the answer is no, then you can get rid of the rule. It's not doing anything. Or you can modify it to make it do something if you still desire to achieve those outcomes. And then secondly, is it necessary to maintain the achievement of those outcomes? Now think back to the headlight example. If we got rid of the DOT requirement that headlights have high beams and low beams and nothing in between, do you think auto manufacturers would suddenly stop putting those on cars? I think it unlikely. I think, in fact, instead what we would see is adaptive headlight systems be an option. So we'd have high beams, low beams on a standard issue car, and then even better on some other cars, the adaptive headlight systems. That's a case where probably we could get rid of that rule and be better off. Or even if the adaptive headlight systems didn't exist, we could get rid of that rule and still have the same outcome. Finally, to wrap things up, I would go back to that linear production process that we have right now for the regulatory system. Instead of having a linear process where Congress acts and then the regulators go off and do their thing forever, pretty much, we'd like to have a feedback loop. So here's the picture I showed you earlier. Congress creates statutes, and then the agency is either created or given some direction, and then regulations come out of that, and there's not much feedback. Instead, very stylized example, if Congress were to create its actions and then agencies were to do prospective analysis, the sort of benefit cost analysis we'd like to see them do prior to making actions, have that be wider spread and high quality, then that leads to the agency action, the choice of whether to regulate or not. The choice is informed by the analysis, which then leads to a regulation, or maybe not. And then finally, importantly, that regulation needs to be retrospectively analyzed. Another stage of analysis needs to be inserted into here, which can then be fed back to Congress. High quality information at every stage along this circle is the key. And so when you're thinking about solutions, how can your solutions deliver high quality information for both these stages of analysis? And then how can Congress act upon that information? How can a feedback loop be built so the information gets passed back to Congress so Congress understands better, did the actual outcomes that we intended with an act come about from regulations? Without that, there's a whole lot of separation and inability to take action. So I think I'll wrap up there, and I'd be happy to answer questions when we're all done with our session. Thank you.
I'm very pleased to have been invited and going to jump right into it. I'm mostly going to focus on three different kinds of approaches to improving regulatory systems. But before I do, I want to touch on some points that I think are important and build off discussion this morning about what's the role of Congress in regulation. So I start with this first slide. I'm not going to walk through the details because some of it's been covered this morning. The basic point I want to make is people sometimes forget regulations are laws, and they are legally binding on Americans, and there's enforcement. And the point is we have reached a point in this country where federal agencies now make more laws per year than Congress does. So we get more laws from the federal bureaucracy than from the people's representatives. Think about that. Two other quick preliminary points about the role of Congress in regulation. I think Doug Holtz-Eakin made the point that regulation and taxing and spending can be interchangeable. You can sometimes accomplish the same goals either by direct federal action using taxpayer dollars or by directing, by laws of regulation, that private parties devote their resources to the same thing, provide free insurance or engage in various kinds of activities. And as the fiscal resources become tight, the desire to use regulation goes up, up, up. And we've seen that occur in the current administration, but not just in the current administration. And then you get to the cumulative point where regulatory costs are so large, and this is a point sometimes lost and not well understood, certainly by the public. The regulatory costs are now, people can debate the exact estimates of regulatory costs, but they're huge and consequential. The National Association of Manufacturers released a study last year that had them exceeding $2 trillion a year. And whether you agree with that exact number or some other estimate, there's little doubt that regulatory costs are, order of magnitude-wise, somewhat commensurate with taxing and exceed discretionary federal spending. So their regulation's hugely consequential, and yet most of it is not actually made by the people's representatives in a direct sense. So let me go on here. How did we get this way? Actually, because Congress delegated a lot of its authority to these regulatory agencies. And I mention that because I want to emphasize that the problem and fixing the problem are not a niche issue that, well, who deals with regulation? Is that the Judiciary Committee or is that the Government Affairs Committee? You know, it's everybody. It's every authorizing committee that created the authority for agencies to engage in rulemaking. It's every oversight committee. And then, surprise, surprise, it's actually a contest with the appropriations committees as to who's going to actually spend more, regulators or appropriators. And so this is relevant to every committee of the House and Senate that authorizes, that appropriates, or that oversees any agencies. So let me transition then. We've had some discussion from the lunch panel, but I want to quickly say, so what currently restrains agencies from arbitrariness or excesses in rulemaking? Short answer, not very much. The Administrative Procedure Act of 1946 is the most significant law, and I would characterize it for the most part as involving minimal due process. And it has not been updated in nearly 70 years. So we are dealing with a law that there's a lot of experience that you heard about earlier. There have been periods of concern. Rulemaking as an activity really got to be bigger and bigger, late 60s, 1970s, and then coming forward. So there have been periodic times where there have been some what would have been perceived as regulatory improvements. They largely impose analytic requirements. Most of them are not judicially reviewable. Most recently, the one that's of interest, the Congressional Review Act of 1996, but it's significant. There's only been one regulation ever that was successfully disapproved by the Congressional Review Act. Came close recently, both houses of Congress on the NLRB elections rule, but the president vetoed that this week. So bottom line on all that is that these other statutes are useful in limited ways to some extent, but clearly there remains much more to do. So I'm going to talk about three approaches, what I call vertical, I'll explain that, horizontal, and comprehensive. Just before I turn to that, I do want to make the point that improving the regulatory process actually should transcend who or which party is in the White House. We run into these obstacles that whichever party has the White House gets a little less interested in regulatory improvement, and I would suggest that in some ways that's a mistake because institutional improvements to fix the lawmaking and use of resource allocations that are going on really ought to transcend that. So let me start with what I call vertical approaches. And what I mean by vertical approaches is bills that target specific agencies or individual problems. They're not looking at the regulatory system as a whole. They're just saying there's a problem at an agency, at the FDA or EPA or the Federal Communications Commission or the NLRB. And I've put up examples of those. There are 3 that have passed the House in March that are at the top. And there are numerous other proposals. And the one observation I'll give about these are all, they have to be looked at in their individual merits as to each bill. But conceptually, there's value to doing this, but it's a narrow slice of life. It's a narrow slice, and so it's got inherent limits. And the other observation I have to make is of the bills that I've listed here, and that if you look through the proposals that are out there, I haven't seen any that propose to reduce the authority of the agency to engage in rulemaking. They want to fix the process, they want to create more transparency, they want to allow more participation, they want to make the science available and so on. I haven't seen any that actually said, you know what, there was this open-ended, just make life better, issue rules, and saying, you know what, maybe it shouldn't be as broad as that bring it back. And related observation, we see reauthorizations of agencies routinely, right? I keep looking for one where the reauthorization does something other than expand the authority of the agency. And so I would say, as we think about regulatory reform, the vertical approach can be useful, but we need to think a little bit about how many of these are actually addressing the fundamental problem of what delegation Congress really intends, and the members of Congress on behalf of the American people really intend in terms of who's going to make the laws. So let me go on to what I call the horizontal approach, which is process improvements to how rules are made across all the agencies that do rulemaking. And these are like some of the bills I've talked about. These are things that add, say, analytical requirements or judicial review or public participation or transparency. They go at it a number of different ways that I'll get into, but they're horizontal because they don't say, let's fix the FCC, let's fix the Consumer Financial Protection Board. They say, let's try to improve the overall process everywhere and thereby make a larger impact on both the cost and the effectiveness of rulemaking. And there are 4 that I'm going to focus on. There'll be a couple of others I'm going to allude to as well, but there are 4 that are really important to be aware of. I don't have time to get into the details of them all, unfortunately, but I want to touch on them. The first and undoubtedly the most significant is H.R. 185, the Regulatory Accountability Act. Passed the House in January. It passed the House the prior 2 Congresses. So it's been a bill that's had numerous hearings and has now passed the House 3 times. It had a bipartisan Senate counterpart last year that was S-1029 with 4 Republicans and 4 Democratic co-sponsors. It has not yet been reintroduced in the Senate this year. I don't know exactly if it will be or if the House bill will be taken up as having been passed. We'll have to see. But it's really makes a number of incremental improvements that are significant. It codifies the cost-benefit requirements that are in an executive order President Clinton issued in 1993 that's been in effect ever since, codifies those, extends the cost-benefit requirements to independent agencies and OIRA supervision of that, improves the notice and comment process, especially for rules that cost more than $100 million a year, adds increased transparency requirements, adds coverage of guidance documents, interpretive rules, policy statements, and other guidance documents, makes the Information Quality Act judicially reviewable, and expands the use of hybrid and formal rulemaking procedures for billion-dollar rules. Not for all rules, but for billion-dollar rules. So it's very consequential, important bill in terms of making what are really incremental improvements. It's not a complete overhaul, but it's a series of incremental improvements that build on much of what Patrick was alluding to. The second and third are the unfunded mandates, Information and Transparency Act, and the Small Business Regulatory Flexibility Improvements. These are bills that have also been through hearings over a number of Congresses. Both have passed the House. To date, they've both been introduced in the Senate, but there's been no action of any kind. These actually build on earlier bills from the 1990s, and they add more analytic requirements, some rules of decision that would require that agencies have to take rules that are cost justified or give a substantial explanation if they depart from that. And they create judicial reviewability of the analytic requirements in the unfunded mandates bill. And then the fourth, we heard some discussion about the problem from Ambassador Gray and his colleagues. It's the bill sometimes referred to as sue and settle, and what it does is add really process requirements that really go to the question, who's going to control the agenda of new rulemakings? And you would think, actually, that the executive branch generally would like this bill in the same way that Congress would, because what it does is it limits the ability of advocacy groups and interest groups to set the agenda. It says if they sue and say, we want a rulemaking by this date and to cover this topic, the agency has to give notice to the public that that suit is coming or has been submitted. It facilitates that if other parties who are interested want to participate in the litigation, that they can, because it's often hard to intervene. And it creates a process that if the suit's going to be settled, there's a kind of a notice and comment process that the public's told about the proposed settlement and can comment on it before the judge approves a consent decree or settlement. So it's a process-based thing. There's a lot of rhetoric about this issue that goes to whether there's collusive behavior and even suggestions of misconduct or whatever. That's actually, in many ways, in my judgment, irrelevant. It just says that if the agency's agenda is going to be set by advocacy groups, the public ought to know what's going on and have a chance to participate. Even if there's nothing nefarious, it's just good process. So that's what that bill does. It was approved by the House in the last Congress. In the current Congress, it's been approved by the House Judiciary Committee, and it's been introduced in the Senate, but again, no action on the Senate side to date. But those are all bills that it's really important to know something about and be aware of, because again, every authorizing committee that has responsibility for agencies that issue rules, these are going to affect it, and I think the members are going to be interested and care. Or at least I hope they will. Two other regulatory improvement bills of note. One is the H.R. 1155, sometimes called the Scrub Act, searching and cutting regulations that are unnecessarily burdensome. This would create a BRAC-like commission to identify rules that are outdated and excessively costly and so forth, and then create a mechanism for a vote to get rid of them and incentives to require agencies to get rid of them on their own in order to do new rules. And again, approved by the House Judiciary Committee in March. To my knowledge, at least, there's not yet a Senate counterpart or any action. There are some other commission-like bills or retrospective review bills that have been introduced in both the House and the Senate, but have received both less attention and are not as robust as the Scrub Act. And then last is a pure transparency bill that I want to mention because it sometimes escapes notice. In the last Congress, there was H.R. 2804, the Alert Act. And this is another one that, in a less polarized world, I think would actually garner wide support, because it's really almost a pure transparency requirement. The executive branch twice a year issues the Unified Regulatory Agenda. That's just a list of rulemakings that agencies are working on, and they do it twice a year. And what this bill largely does is require them to update that monthly, make it electronically accessible, and provide some specification of categories of information that would be included to be useful to the public. And they're not very onerous. They're what's the legal basis for the rulemaking, what's the schedule, within huge parameters, what's the estimated cost? Under 100 million, between 105 million, 1 billion, 5 billion, you know, big ranges. So that bill has not, to my knowledge, and Daniel can correct me, I don't think that's been reintroduced in the current Congress, but I would expect it would be.
It will be.
Okay. Because it passed, and I said that because it passed the House in the last Congress, did not move in the Senate, but assuming it comes back this Congress, I would think that has some interest. And it's also interest for the, as setting the table, in a sense, for the third approach. I want to talk about the across-the-board or comprehensive approach to reform of agency lawmaking. And what I mean by this, because sometimes people say, well, why isn't horizontal across the board? And it is, but it's not comprehensive in thinking about what is the overall number of laws that are being made by agencies and the overall cost of those laws, and thinking in a way of what are the prioritizations. And so in the last couple of Congresses, there were bills of two types that fit this truly comprehensive. Some were moratoriums, right? They were just timeouts. The economy's bad, let's take a timeout. I don't think there are any of those currently introduced in the current Congress. And then there was the Reins Act, which basically said rules couldn't go in effect if they involved 100 million or more, so major rules, without an affirmative vote of Congress enabling them. And that's the Reins Act. That passed the House the last two Congresses, but to my understanding is, although it's been reintroduced, hasn't had any action in either House so far this year. To do those kind of things, you really need a larger consensus about the institutional will of the Congress to reassert its control over the rulemaking authority it's delegated. And that probably will take more time to create bipartisan interest and would be very hard to do, I think, today. But, and this is where I wanted to transition to and where I think the Alert Act is a bit of a setup for. There's a concept that historically has had more bipartisan approach and is more nuanced and balanced, and that's the concept of a regulatory budget or regulatory cost caps that are really akin to how fiscal policy is done under the budget control or the Congressional Budget Act, where there are, you know, overall discretionary spending limits and then allocations to different segments. And there could be a regulatory counterpart to that. And the concept actually dates back to the Carter administration. There were legislative proposals that came from Senator Lloyd Bentsen, who was a Democrat from Texas and was President Clinton's Treasury Secretary. Some people who have to be closer to my age remember he was also Michael Dukakis' running mate. But anyway, the point was this concept has had more of a bipartisan history. And Dr. Beach made some reference to it coming back in the budget reform context. So I wanted a flag for this group. In the last Congress, there was a proposal, S-2153, H.R. 5184. It didn't actually get action, but it's an example of the concept. There's many different iterations of how to do this that I don't have time to explain, but a little self-promotion here. If you're interested in more on the subject, a co-author and I recently published a article on the regulatory budget revisited, and you can find it in the most recent issue of the Administrative Law Review, which I'm sure all of you read regularly. With that said, that's the overview of three different approaches, legislative items that are pending, and our efforts to try to get Congress back in the game, not for its own sake, but to improve the regulatory process and its accountability to the American people.
right, very good. Made by Douglas Holtz-Eakin. Not on? It's on. One of the statements in one of the earlier panels was by Douglas Holtz-Eakin, who gave us a prediction, sounded an alarm to the effect that he thought that as resources to spend became less available to the federal government, obviously they're becoming less available day by day, he predicted that the federal impulse to act would migrate to regulation. And so I just wanted to ask my co-panelists what their thoughts were on the accuracy of that prediction, and if it is accurate, what that means if we don't enact very soon some of the reform bills that you discussed.
Is my mic working? Yeah, I hear a little bit. There we go. So I think it's a good point. The substitutability of regulations and taxes and other sorts of fiscal endeavors of Congress is real, and the opacity of regulations can tempt Congress to act via regulation rather than in some way that would require CBO analysis to put up a headline that says this action is going to cost the economy X billion or trillion dollars. So it's very much, as resources become more scarce, I suspect that temptation will be stronger and stronger simply because of that opacity. And I do think that some of the solutions discussed would help that to whatever degree prospective analysis of regulations, or even take it a step farther back, prospective analysis of the impacts of legislation, looking at their regulatory outcomes or most likely regulatory outcomes and what the regulatory cost of legislation would be, could help remove some of that temptation, some of that opacity.
I think it's worse than what the kid said, in that we're already there. If you just look at the last 6 years as an example, obviously Congress has not wanted and hasn't increased the corporate income tax, for example. But the regulatory process has added regulations that have imposed $633 billion of new costs. Now, they don't all fall on business, right? Because universities bear the cost of regulation, hospitals, apartment buildings, individuals. But if the administration had come in and said, we have a bunch of good things we think we want to do, or members of Congress said, and we want to take the corporate income tax, which was about $320 billion last year, and we want to get $500 billion out of the business community, that might have been a heavy lift. So if instead they said, well, we won't raise taxes from $320 billion to $500 billion, we'll add regulatory costs of $180 billion. That's a light lift. As we heard today, the checks on that, the checks and balances on that, are not very robust. So that's already going on.